Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today we go up, and away to discuss the music of Superman, the new film about the iconic superhero from director James Gunn. Joining us today are the film's composers, Jon Murphy and David Fleming, in a two-part conversation with our regular guest host, Jon Burlingame. They discuss the joy of creating original music for their longtime comic book hero and, of course, that iconic John Williams theme. I'll let Jon take it from here, first with composer Jon Murphy.
Jon Murphy, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Great to see you again, Jon.
So obviously we're talking about Superman today, but I wonder if we can begin by talking about your relationship with James Gunn, the director. I think you guys go back a little bit. What have you done in the past with James, and when did you get the call to come on board with Superman?
I think we go back 6 years now. The Suicide Squad was the first movie, and I came on to that while we were shooting. So I got to write some of the themes that the actors were shooting to, which was, I'd never done before, which was just amazing. It's how James likes to work. And then we did Guardians 3. And then we did the Guardians holiday special. And then this, we got this was the big call. I don't remember the exact date, but it was a few months before they started shooting.
What's your history with Superman? Did you read the comics or did you know the movies? What did you know of Superman before you started to work on the film?
I'm happy to say it goes all the way back to the comics, which is kind of weird because in Liverpool, in England in that time, comic books weren't really a huge thing. We had these rubbish, I think we had the Dandy and Beano, which were the worst, about a cat and about a guy with a big chin. And that was about as much as we got. But where we lived right by the docks in Liverpool, and there used to be a very sketchy little kiosk for the sailors that would come in off the Scandinavian ships. And it had, untold sketchy things in this little kiosk. But what they did have was one shelf that had American comic books. And it always looked so exotic to me, And I used to go in there with my mum. And one day I said, Mum, can you get me one of those magazine things there, and she got me a few. And that was the beginning. I was probably about 6 or 7. She shouldn't really have been buying me stuff like that, to be honest, but she didn't care. It was like, it'd keep me quiet, for an hour. But that was the beginning of the whole, and it wasn't just DC, it was the Marvel stuff. It was whatever. And there was all these amazing, like, Tales from the Crypt, and it was just all this exotic stuff. But one of those first comic books was Superman. And so, and when you're a kid, it's an amazing age to be exposed to this stuff because your imagination is at its best and you, so I just fell in love, and that was the beginning of, the whole comic book thing. And I used to, every time I'd buy them, I'd put them in a box in order so that I could go back to the beginning and read the first one again. So, and then obviously the movie came out.
The 1978 film.
Yeah. That kind of changed everything, didn't it, really?
Yeah.
It kind of started the whole thing off.
James is interesting as a director because I know he's super sensitive to music and
very
fascinated not only by songs, as we saw in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, but also by score. And so I'm curious to know, what kind of discussions did you have with James about what music could or should do?
For a start, he's probably the most musically intuitive director I've ever worked with. He just knows when something's right and he knows when it's not working, so he's been an amazing creative collaborator. I trust him completely with music. He gets it. He really does. But the first conversation we had, when the call came in, when I tried to keep me cool, he was very, James doesn't leave any details, and, any conversation with him has gone through a lot of thought. And, he said to me from the very, very beginning, this score is going to be unlike any score that I've done before. it's going to be much more thematic based, less reliant on cool songs and juxtaposition in that way. And it needs to be a big, grand, I don't want to use the word traditional because it's the last thing that James Gunn is, but he was very clear that it was that this film was going to have a different approach to the music.
What about the use of the original John Williams theme, which is so sort of associated with the character? Was there any thought that maybe you should go in a fresh, new direction, or was it always the idea that we needed to somehow rely on the original Williams theme?
No, it was actually never set in stone, but it was talked about early on. And the conversations were more, can we look into this? Can we try? Can we see what happens? Because we're both very respectful of, it's not just an iconic motif, it's an iconic score. And again, that set off a whole kind of subgenre in itself in terms of how superhero movies were scored. It all started with that one score. So we were incredibly respectful of that. But, James being James, he wanted to see, how could we reimagine this? How can we make, how can we have our cake and eat it? Are there ways that we can use this magic secret sauce but make it so that it feels like it's fresh and it's bold and, so it was probably the best bit of the process for me was actually working with Jon's theme because, I felt like I was holding something sacred, and there were, I tried so many different things. There was a doom version of the theme, there was even a punk version of it at one point, and at some point you go, okay, I'm going to go to composer hell here if I do this. But what was amazing and what was eye-opening for me was no matter what style you did that motif in, I changed it from a major to a minor. I slowed it down to half speed. I put it through the ringer, but no matter what I did, it was always that theme. And it was kind of an epiphany because you just think, well, that surely is the test. That's the mark of what I call a proper theme, that you can change it from a major to a minor. You can pull it to pieces. You can drag the notes out. And it still has that same effect, so it was a very enjoyable process. But I did feel like I was, what are they doing leaving me with this, Are they crazy? So it was all very respectful but it was a very proud time in the process to be working with such a groundbreaking, iconic theme.
I remember sitting through the movie. I remember hearing it played on electric guitar at some point. Maybe
that was me, unfortunately.
Fairly early. Oh, that's you.
That's me. Yeah. I worried about that one. It was funny because, I did it while I was working on another piece, and I was just happened to be holding the guitar, and I just played it while I was waiting for Tyler to set a sound up. And, I did it in that kind of Hendrix Star Spangled Banner, and it made me smile. And I thought, hang on, could we get away with that? So I thought, well, if I can't get away with it with James Gunn, I can't get away with anybody. So I sent it to James. And of course, that ended up being the trailer, which was the very first, exposure to the world of what we were doing with the movie. So, so that was scary, but it felt fun doing it. But, it's still that beautiful thing.
So also, and another sort of fresh approach here is that it's not the kind of symphonic sound that Jon did in 1978. This seems like a very sort of much more updated kind of hybrid of traditional orchestra, but also synths and electronics, and as you point out, guitars. Can you talk a little bit about the overall soundscape of the movie?
What Jon did was groundbreaking and beautiful and timeless, but Jon had already done that. There was no point, in trying to emulate, that approach, because he'd already done that. So, it was always in our mind to, take it somewhere else. And, but that being said, we had conversations that, we wanted to retain the purity of the character of Superman, that simple integrity and that honesty and that purity. So, we thought it might be very effective to keep a lot of that purity with Superman. But, he's facing, these modern challenges, in the story. And we have very modern, high-tech antagonists and, with their own agenda. So, it seemed quite an obvious thing for the score to be a hybrid of, on one side, the purity of the orchestral music, but then when we were dealing with the challenges that he has to face, we can be very, we can be a lot more edgy, we can be more modern, and then, we were hoping that would kind of contrast. And, when you have those two different approaches to a score, you get a lot of interesting things when you mash them together. When you kind of throw them at each other and you get the purity versus the synths and guitars and edginess and it wasn't just, very new characters that he had to deal with. There was new situations, a lot of the film is in this, I don't want to give the game away, but it's in a very different environment to what we would expect. And so that gives you license to create a whole new world musically. So, I think, having that contrast is good in a score. It just gave us that freedom to mess around and be a little more modern and a bit more edgy.
So let's talk about the bad guys. I mean, Lex Luthor.
The bad guys.
Lex Luthor really sort of hovers over this movie as, maybe one of the worst bad guys in movie history. This guy is out to kill Superman. So what did you need to do for him musically?
I mean, as soon as I read the script, that character, which kind of resonates with a few characters in the real world right now, let's be honest. I won't mention any names, but yeah, powerful character, great storytelling. But also a very, very complex character. He's got the grandiosity and the narcissism and all of these very interesting things that you can plug into musically. But, in some ways he's also, he is the smartest guy in the world and he has got a right to have a grievance, and he's also very human. So what was, I think, wonderful about the two main characters is that for all the, sort of exaggerated parts of their character, they're also incredibly human in their own way. So that, it was a beautiful character to write for. In fact, there are actually two themes for Lex in the movie. One when he's dominant, which is for much of the movie. But, there's also as things start to unravel and we start and he begins to reveal more of himself, then, there's a tragedy to it, because he could have been a great man that could have been so good for the world, could have been the greatest, but he's got this, chink in his armor, and he has these, like psychological issues, and there's the tragedy.
one of the other sides, scenes that we needed, I think, as a kind of relief from sort of the relentless, battles and Superman versus Lex, is the Lois character, Lois Lane. And so, and Lois and Clark have sort of wonderful scenes together, sometimes romantic, sometimes less so. What did you need to do for that relationship?
I mean, Rachel's brilliant as Lois. What I loved, and, this was all in the script, is, how grounded they were. You had, you've got them bickering. You've got Superman getting wound up with his girlfriend. I mean, how wonderful is that? Such beautiful human scenes. So it was obvious that we could be a little more intimate with, and a little more fragile with their whole love relationship. And, the best scenes with Lois are those incredibly human, very intimate, beautiful scenes where you completely believe that they love each other. You believe that they've got problems with their relationship, and you understand why. That was a beautiful moment to, break the score right down into very small elements and just show that these are very human people with very human problems. It's some of my favorite scenes are the scenes where they're just being girlfriend and boyfriend. It's beautiful stuff.
Remind me that there's acoustic guitar, I think, isn't there?
Yeah.
In one of those scenes?
There is, yeah. We use acoustic in a few scenes, and then towards the end, you've got it's almost like a, what's the word? There's this, sort of summing up of what we've seen, and it starts with the acoustic. And I love that cue because it started with me doing the acoustic and this, and then Dave came in and added these beautiful strings and orchestras. So, that cue was a true collaboration, but it's, the reasoning behind it was, what I love about acoustic guitar is you kind of believe it. With electric guitar, you've got to be careful because, it's easy to make it, you can do a lot of things with it. And with acoustic guitar, it's a very human instrument that's literally touching your chest and your stomach as you play it. I know an electric is, but most of the sound comes out of an amplifier. But when you're playing an acoustic, there's something so organic about it. So when you have scenes in a movie where you want to just get much closer and listen in, then the acoustic guitar is it's so soulful as well, so it was a lovely instrument to just bring the audience much, much, much closer in to the characters. So that's why it worked so well.
Now, you mentioned Dave. That's a reference to Dave Fleming.
Dave Fleming, yes.
I think it came in a bit later. And so did you guys actually collaborate on some scenes?
We never got to write in the room together, which is a real shame because I was with Dave the other night at the premiere and we both said, that would have been fun. But we were all in different places and, one of the saddest things about technology as a composer is that you can just write something and send it to the director within 3 minutes. The days of the director coming over and sitting with him at the piano are gone, sadly. And that's a shame. But, there are scenes in the score where it's, it goes from my theme to Dave's theme and then, so there are collaborations creatively. It's just that we never got to sit in the room with a beer together, which would have been cool, because, I like Dave a lot. He's a great guy.
What was the recording process like? I'm guessing that you had lots of pre-records, maybe that you had done in your studio, but obviously there's also an orchestra and I think a choir too.
There is, yeah. I always do the non-orchestral stuff in my own studio, which is where I am now. I love this place, and all of the guitars, all of the drums, anything we can fit in that room next door, we'll record. But when you do the orchestra, you've got to go to one of the big places, and we recorded all of the big stuff at Eastman on the Warner's lot.
When we hear the choir, are they actually singing anything? I'm always curious to know if there are actual words that we're hearing.
You know what? We thought about that, but we just felt it would have been too leading. And the other cheat of like singing Latin when you have choirs, so it sounds like words, it just didn't feel appropriate here. So we thought we'd just keep it pure and just let the melodies speak for itself. So it's mostly very emphatic R's and O's and vocal effects and stuff. But we avoided having them singing lyrics.
What does having choir add to a movie like this?
Choirs are amazing. I really didn't really appreciate them as much as I used to till about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I think, like obviously a sense of grandeur. You get that scale with a choir that nothing else comes close. But in the context of a movie like this, the sound of one human voice will, come out and, on top of a huge orchestra, it will be where the ear goes to, because we're humans and you hear a human voice and you want to hear what it's saying. But when you have, 60 or 70 human voices all singing as one, there's not a sound in the world that comes close. It's the only thing that tops an orchestra for me. And in a movie like this, if you want to have that sense of hope, nothing. I mean, all the good guys knew it. Beethoven knew it. Mozart knew it. Let's get the choir in.
That's right.
Because nothing does hope like a massive choir.
Is it true that your daughter Molly got to contribute something to the score?
She did. She composed most of the Luthor theme, which is what we hear when quite at the beginning of the movie, Ultraman flies back to base, and then we have this huge big reveal of Luthor, and it's basically presenting this world of antagonists that we're going to be dealing with. Great track you did, and then it reprises again when Luthor and his guys land in Antarctica. So yeah, it's kind of the coolest. She's cooler than me, so she's good at that stuff. But she also played the crystal bachette on all of the love themes too.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That crazy big instrument with all the glass rods. Yeah, I wanted to do it, but she was better at it than me, so I had to give in.
Why the crystal bachet? What did that bring to the score?
I originally got it for the Fortress of Solitude, the ice fortress, because, it's made of crystal rods and it's played with water. You usually have your hands over it. I mean, Dave ended up doing that scene, but we used it in the love themes, which was, because it's a very soulful, mournful sound, and, it worked out beautifully for that. So, yeah, I mean, I've wanted to buy one for years, John. So I need an excuse to say to Charlotte, my wife, what I really need on this is a huge big monstrosity with like 40 glass crystal rods. You play it with your hands with water and it has these like Flash Gordon big metal flares on it. It'll be, I had to wait for the right movie, So this was the movie to make that case. So, I took advantage and bought one.
So looking back now, John, what was the biggest challenge in doing this movie, all told?
I mean, obviously the scale of it is enormous, and I think the biggest challenge, or the thing I was the most conscious of was being respectful to the history. It doesn't get any bigger than this. And as a composer, it doesn't get any bigger than, working with John Williams' themes. So it's, it was just always trying to be respectful enough, not just with the history of what Superman is, but with the history of what John Williams is. He's the man. So that was the bigger challenge. Working with James is never hard work. He's a roller coaster of, ideas and support. But yeah, for me, that was the biggest challenge, is just keeping an eye on both sides, of being able to work with these amazing, pieces of inspiration.
Well, congratulations, John. It's an amazing job for an amazing film, and we're so glad that you could share your experiences with us today.
No, it's been a real pleasure. It's always a pleasure with you, John.
So we're here with David Fleming. David, thanks for joining us today for talking about Superman.
Thank you so much, John.
So we know you, of course, as the Emmy-winning composer of the Jim Henson documentary, and that you've worked with Hans Zimmer on projects like Blue Planet 2. So how did you become involved with James Gunn and Superman? Yes,
it was a quite surprising but happy phone call from my friends at Warner Brothers. James obviously, is kicking off the DCU, and Superman is a really big project. And James had this great working relationship with John. They've gone back on a few films and done so much great work on the Guardians films and Suicide Squad. But I think there was a feeling that Superman, Superman is a big deal, and I think there was a feeling of, let's get two voices on this. I've been a co-composer on lots of projects, so I know how sometimes two heads can be better than one, especially when tackling a character that means so much to so many people, and of course requires a score that has quite a lot of scope and covers different boundaries.
What's your history with the character? Did you read the comic books, or did you grow up with the movies? What was your knowledge of Superman before you came to the project?
Quite a lot, actually. Like, I was trying not to nerd out too much in meetings, getting excited about, like, Guy Gardner, for instance, being a Green Lantern, because comics were my really big introduction to the character, even more so than the films. I remember, I think my first comic book was, ironically enough, the Death of Superman graphic novel that my dad had bought. And he was a comics fan growing up, and I remember him coming home with that, and me, just kind of, what is this? And then just reading it front to back over and over. So when I saw James's film, I recognized immediately that there's something about the essence of the comics specifically that he's captured, especially that era of the comics. And there's so many colorful characters and, fantastical worlds. I think for a long time in adaptations of comic books, it's gone towards gritty and grounded and real, and how can we make this real? And I think he really embraced the colorful sort of magic of the comics, and as well as, just this really optimistic and hopeful vision of Superman, the character, which also, I recognized, from those early experiences, reading those comics.
But I have to ask you, how big a challenge was this when you're dealing with one of the most iconic characters of fiction in the 20th century, coupled with the fact that you have this iconic John Williams theme that I gather sort of needed to be incorporated throughout. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I tried not to think too much about the pressure of it, because it was enough to get this film done. And also, it was interesting because James obviously wanted to capture something of the spirit of that original Richard Donner film, and those first two films especially. But at the same time, it's a James Gunn film. It is very singular, and it is his voice. But yeah, obviously everyone who works in film music reveres John Williams, and that score is kind of a gem of film music. So to be asked to explore the DNA of that theme was, a privilege, but definitely a humbling privilege, because you are confronted with this iconic, this truly iconic theme. It did help that it was James's film, and it was already in the film when I came on the process. In addition to John Murphy's amazing love theme and his great Lex theme, he had done this guitar version, electric guitar version of John Williams' Superman theme that was already at a pivotal point in the film, and then it was used in the trailers as well. So it was there, and but at the same time, there still felt like there was a lot to explore within that the confines of that theme. There's certain aspects of Superman that needed different approaches. So my approach to coming on board was to talk to James about which pieces of the theme can we kind of explore for different parts. For instance, the action beats, we're often using the A part of the theme, the call, da, 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 as sort of a jumping off point for the action. And then for sort of big epic moments like John Murphy was using there, we're using what I call the chorus. I don't know, I'm sure John Williams has a better name for it, but the dun, 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 dun. And so those were already in place in those sorts of moments, and they made a lot of sense to use. But I also saw there was a room for a thread kind of about Superman's conflict throughout the film, which is, why is he on Earth? There were sort of some unsolved scenes about him confronting, the message from his Kryptonian parents and what it meant to really his purpose on Earth. And we were trying to figure it out. And I remember I was having a meeting with James, and I said, the part of John Williams' theme that always really touched me is the end, the sort of cadence, the da 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 da. This major seventh jump. There's something about it that's hopeful, really, really hopeful. And I started playing around with it with some different chords, and I could tell, James was getting, sort of moved by it, and it was obviously it's there, it's in the theme, but exploring it in a different way, slowing it down and making it a more sort of somber thing. It felt like we were discovering something and finding something new that fit his Clark Kent and his Superman as well.
It's one of the most interesting things about the score, I think, because as I was watching the movie, I kept thinking, I think these guys have deconstructed the original Williams theme and utilized different aspects of it in ways that we had never heard before.
His theme is so rich. It's so rich. And it did be exactly what you said. It became about how do we use this piece here, this piece there. So almost creating three sides of Clark's story using that original DNA in new ways. Obviously, I will say that one of the first things we tried was, hey, is there a place where we just play it straight up and we play the original march and everything? And obviously, it's a glorious piece of music, and maybe it could have worked for a scene, but it didn't seem to fit James's movie as a whole. And I can't speak for James, but I think there was something about, let's embrace the spirit of this DNA. Let's make a loving cover, but let's not be a tribute band, because they already did it perfectly. And how do we capture that spirit and use parts of that DNA of Jon's beautiful theme, but make something for David's Superman.
And also, can you talk a little bit about the soundscape of the movie in general? Because this is not a straight symphonic score the way John Williams might have done it did do it in 1978. But in fact, this seems like much more of a hybrid, which incorporates orchestra and choir and synths and electronics and maybe some unusual instruments beyond that. Can you talk a little bit about the overall sound?
Yeah, sure. I mean, guitar was definitely a big deal already when I came aboard. Like I said, Jon had done this great guitar arrangement of the theme, and also conceptually, it was important that I wanted to keep that going through what I was doing as well, because there's something that James points to about Clark's character, musically related. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I think
wanted to ask you about that, because we do learn a little bit about Clark's musical tastes partway through the film. That was a factor then.
Yeah, I always certainly kept in mind, and I think it was something that is quietly subversive about the character, because the tricky thing about Superman is that he is sincere and he is hopeful and optimistic, and so much of our culture and superhero movies have sort of pushed that out of vogue, and it's been more about edgy and dark and gritty, and them saying essentially that Superman's sincerity and his hope and his belief in humanity is so rare that now that is punk rock. It is punk rock to be hopeful and optimistic. And so I thought that keeping the guitar as a character throughout was important. Even when we have the giant orchestra and the giant choir, we had two amazing world-class guitar players at our disposal, Yvette Young, incredible guitarist I've worked with many times before, and Andrew Sinowick. They really sort of thread that needle all the way through. And sometimes you're not even aware that you're hearing guitar with the orchestra, but it's often there. That became some of the fun, and obviously Jon had already established some synths for Lex, so keeping that in the palette was really important. I think it was, we're using the John Williams theme. We needed to have an amazing brass section, lucky enough to have that in Los Angeles, an amazing string orchestra, lucky enough to have that in Los Angeles, and woodwinds, choir. We all got to record in town. It has to be there. It has to be the cornerstone. But the thing about James's vision being so colorful meant that, yes, let's open it up to guitars. Let's open up to synths, drum kit in a couple cues. The Justice Gang has their own colors and things like that. So, yeah, it was just about embracing that colorful vision and trying to make it as fun as comics were for me to read.
So let's talk about some of those secondary characters. What about the Justice Gang, and what about these super powerful villains that you're up against? Did they need their own sound or their own approach?
Yeah, a lot of what I started with, because there's obviously a lot of action in the film and a lot of Superman to crack, but that's a scary thing to start with. So I remember what I came and started with was actually the Daily Planet stuff.
Ooh,
which
let's talk
strangely,
about that.
yeah, which I was very excited about. My mother was a newspaper reporter. I love movies about journalists on a mission, and strangely enough, it was the one area of the film that hadn't even been temped. Like it was all played dry. And I thought, hey, there's an opportunity here to have them, be their own kind of heroes and have it, because there is an investigation going on throughout the film as well. And it also gave us a chance to inject some kind of like light momentum. When you're dealing with superheroes and supervillains, it can get very heavy, and by having this like kind of intrepid pushing theme, it gave the movie a chance to move in different ways that it wasn't. Also with the Justice Gang, and also with Crypto, there was a lot of room to define James's tone, because these are characters that are a little lighter in nature. And James obviously has an amazing sense of humor, and all of his movies are interlaced with humor. So each one of those was its own trick of tone to figure out. The Justice Gang was, I think of them as superheroes that, Superman Clark, he's got a very well-defined moral center. He knows what he is and why he's doing what he's doing. The Justice Gang are a little more cynical. They're a little more mercenary. They tend to make a mess of things. And they're kind of like, they're like the Spice Girls of superheroes. They're kind of put together by Max Lord, is what the story is. So their theme music was really fun for me, because it's almost, I think of it almost as like they think they should have superhero music, and this is the superhero music that they imagine. So it's a little cheeky, it's a little silly and bombastic, but it was really fun to do that. Like for instance, I had a great drummer friend of mine, Hal Rosenfeld, and I personally stay away from drum kit on action cues typically, and I was like, the Justice Gang is the perfect people to do big drum fills throughout. So that was fun having Hal come do that. And then Crypto was an interesting little puzzle as well, because he's his own hero and is a little bit related to Superman, and often is just jumping in for these little moments. So I gave him his own, it's really a little motif that can also act as an intro to our Superman music. was really fun, kind of tackling these side characters, and of course, always keeping your eye on number one on the call sheet, Superman, and making sure he was covered.
What was the process like with James Gunn? Would you confer with him every few days? If you came up with something fresh, would you run it by him? What was the process like?
It was pretty constant and ongoing. His role is so interesting because he's the director and he's also the studio head. So I don't envy the amount that he is sort of having to keep track of, but he's an amazingly creative guy, and
he loves music.
Loves music, and has such a good ear for what's going to work. Famously, his needle drops are often centerpieces of his film, and there's one amazing one in this. But I think it's a testament to his love of Superman as a character, that he knew that this film needed to rely a little more on score than maybe some of the ones in his past have. Even though they had fantastic scores, there was I think it was much more an even split of big needle drop moments and original score. So really, really fun.
You mentioned that there's a lot of action in this movie, and in many scenes, Superman is, I guess we could say, not always winning. And I'm wondering not only how you treated those scenes, and there's so many action scenes, how do you go about ratcheting up the tension and keeping us, glued to the screen, if you will, without repeating yourself?
Yeah, that's tricky. I've been lucky enough to work on lots of action, and that's always the trick is how to, start at a 10 and still feel like you're going up and up and up. I mean, I think the trick on this was figure out when he's winning and when he's losing, exactly what you were saying. And obviously when he's winning, we know what DNA we're invoking in those moments. But yeah, I love that James's version of Superman is a little bit, I love that he is getting beat up a bit. Like I was always an Indiana Jones guy versus a James Bond guy. And, James Bond is always in control. He's always, adjusting his cufflinks. And Indiana Jones is getting beat up. And I think that makes the audience, it endears him to the audience in a different way, to see a character who has weaknesses and is figuring it out. And, David's performance, I think, really sort of underlines that. He's very vulnerable, and there's a moment where he gives a speech at the end, which is essentially James's vision of the character, about him being, yes, he's an alien, but what's special about him, what makes us love him, is his humanity. And so I think always sort of being tapped into that was key.
There's also a lot of choir in this score, and I'm wondering what the idea was, why choir is important here, why you felt it was important, and what sequences needed choir, what choir brings to this kind of film.
Choir is, especially here in Los Angeles, they have it's immediate soul into the film. There's an immediate breath, not literally, but just something. There's something that really gets in touch with the human side of Superman. I found so when I mentioned that sort of that message part of the theme, or what we were using as the message or the purpose thread. Superman, you can get lost in the costume and you can get lost in the iconography, and brass is obviously a part of that, and the orchestra. But there's something about the choir, especially the way they sang on some of these cues, that gets more to the human side of Superman. There's something maybe about our Superman being a bit emotional. It's very tricky with what James wanted, because when I came onto the project, he told me about his vision for Superman, and essentially he wants him to be very sincere but not self-serious. That's what it was. It was that he can't be ironic. He doesn't want to be overly edgy, but he's also not. The myth of Superman is not more important than the Clark Kent character. So I hope that using the choir, using acoustic guitar, even in some of the action scenes, and especially when he's on the farm with his parents, it sort of cuts those elements, I think, cut through the iconography and through what we know, and the red, yellow, and blue, and it's like, what is the character, and what's his conflict, and who is he at the end of the day?
Dave, can you talk a little bit about the pocket universe that we encounter late in the film and what musically that needed?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because, at the beginning of the film, we've already established Lex through Jon's great theme. But it felt like we needed something else, where when we went to this pocket universe and this, like when the film goes into the sci-fi, in a big way. And the fun of that was creating this theme that could eventually break out and become this disaster theme, essentially, that becomes a rift, and comes into our world. So the fun of that was it was definitely a synthy theme. We have these kind of portamento synth lines. And what I had the orchestra do, the string section, is I cut them down the middle, or sort of every other player, and had them record the theme, and then had the other half of the orchestra record the theme. And then for these portamento moves, we panned them outwards from the center. So as the pocket universe is tearing open our world, the orchestra follows the synthesizers and sort of goes out to the left and right of the stereo image. When you're in the mix process, you've already handled the fun of writing, so you have to find more fun to be had. But it was cool because it gave us another a villain motif in a way to play with, or a disaster motif, so that we didn't get tired of Lex, and that his music comes back at the right points. If the pocket universe is calculated one picometer off, I don't know if that's a real thing, then it can get really out of hand. So it was fun sort of starting small and making a full-blown disaster out of it.
As the second composer on the score, was there a lot of time pressure for you? Did you have to do a lot in a short period of time?
I've had all sorts of schedules, and work always expands or contracts to the amount of time, and having a ton of time can sometimes work against you. Look, at the end of the day, I would love to be working on Superman, this movie, for the next 4 years, and just tinkering with every cue and finding more things about the John Williams cues. I'm going to say this just with you here, because I think you'll appreciate it specifically. There's this one little brass run that I use that is just very secret to me and very close to me. That's right from the last couple bars of John Williams' Superman March, and it's used to close out his piece. And I use it as a fill in a couple places. The trombones just moving really fast, and it was amazing when we recorded it with our trombone section. They all just started laughing because it was immediately that thing, you know. So of course I'd love to tinker, but you know, it was so exciting to get to be a part of this vision as it was coming together and work alongside the great stuff that John Murphy had done, and you know, and start this new universe and this new vision that has a lot of reverence for the past, but still looking forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the recording sessions. How big was your orchestra? And I think you said you recorded here in Los Angeles.
Yes, I'm prepared for this question, John, because I think we talked during Blue Planet, and your first question was, how big was your orchestra? And it had been a couple months, and I completely forgot, and I blanked out. I think our orchestra, 77 players, and then we had a 24-piece choir, so quite a lot, and as well as our fantastic guitarists and drummers, and so it meant a lot to me, and I know it meant a lot to the players, and they're just fantastic, and it was such a privilege to get to work with that many talented people for a nice amount of time.
So if I'm not mistaken, this is a Dolby Atmos release, and I'm wondering, when you're writing or mixing, does that play a part in your thinking about how, you know, what the spread is and how people are going to hear it and perceive the score?
I always think about that. I'm not traditional in the sense that it's everyone in the room together. I respect it so much, but it's not the school I come from, and it's much more about the recording and the finished mix as a document. We had two amazing mixers, Gustavo Borner, Justin Moskowitz, who did an amazing job, and they recorded it in Atmos so that it was ready for the theater. I'm actually going over there today to listen to Atmos versions for headphones. So, because I know this is probably the way it will continue to be in the future, and it's really exciting. And I have personally found that when you're in an Atmos theater, it gives the music a place to not fight the sound effects, and hopefully to shine through. So yeah, I'm excited, you know, about people hearing it, and you know, hopefully not everyone's just listening to or watching on their iPhones. At the end of the day,
yes, please.
It's
no.
definitely a theatrical film, but you know, you can only control so much.
So at the end of the day, what would you say was the biggest challenge you faced in this whole project?
I think the challenge was really, how can we stay true to this character, and most importantly, figure out the tone that doesn't feel like we're telling a bunch of different stories. It was how. That's why when I mentioned that thread before, finding these threads that felt like they were saying something new about these characters, and hopefully deepening them too. It's tricky. I found, working with Hans on the Lion King remake, that it's very tricky to make something for a story or for characters that people already have a lot of themselves invested in, and a lot of their childhoods. And I can't think of a character that's more like that than Superman. I mean, everyone has different experiences. I obviously started with the comics. I love the Christopher Reeves movie. I love the Zack Snyder movie. I love what Hans did. I love John's theme. I love the animated series, which has beautiful music too. So but everyone has their own experience and their own version of the character and why it's important to them. And you have to respect all of those things, and at the same time say, this is our own version, and we hope that people see that inner spirit that maybe connects on different versions, but it's always tricky to tackle a character that has that much that means that much to so many people. And I think James really did an amazing job figuring that out. And I'm really glad to see that people are responding to it positively. And I think it's a good time for it. I think it's a really good time for an optimistic take on Superman. I hope it feels fresh to people and refreshing.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is the perfect time for a much more optimistic, in a way, kind of sunnier version than we've seen in recent times. So I think it's the time. And you guys have done a great job. Congratulations on the score for Superman. Dave Fleming, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, John.
Many thanks to David and John for joining us on the podcast today. And thanks to Jon Burlingame for these excellent conversations. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Warner Brothers and DC Studios for helping put this conversation together. Be sure to check out Superman, now in theaters and Dolby cinemas in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. We'll have links, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.